Welcome everyone. Glad to see you on my channel. Today I will tell you about an unusual story, an amazing story about companionship and love. I wish you a pleasant audience. Cindy was slowly walking after her night shift towards the mall. The previous afternoon, the girl had seen a colorful ad on the internet, which said that today, in the shopping and entertainment complex, which was not far from her place of work, will be very large discounts, up to 70% on the entire range of clothing. The only disadvantage of such a truly luxurious offer, Victoria, was that the whole holiday of life will last only one day. So the thrifty nurse, who was Cindy, had no choice but to go to the global sale immediately after the end of the working day. Of course, she could have done her shopping on any other, more convenient day. But Cindy wasn't used to throwing her money around, let alone buying things that were sold at a huge markup because of a popular brand or because they were an exclusive part of a new collection. It didn't mean that Cindy didn't like to dress well. She just didn't see the difference between a coat bought in the first month of sales and the same coat sold in the summer, for example, when the demand for it would no longer be so great, but the price would drop, and quite substantially. In addition, the girl belonged to the few fans of wearing one, but high-quality thing for several seasons in a row, so the choice or purchase always approached very responsibly. Finally, the enticing lights of the mall loomed ahead. Cindy felt a slight thrill as she entered the wide, revolving doors of the mall. She hadn't been here often enough, so every visit was a celebration. From inside, everything looked even more colorful and modern than she remembered from the last time she'd been here. The mall seemed to be a magical place, like a Rubik's Cube or a kaleidoscope. Every time she visited, Cindy noticed that it was even more beautiful, and the interiors were more and more trendy and bold. Today, despite the fact that it was only 10 minutes past noon, the mall was densely packed with people. Among the many colorful lights and illuminations, creating a truly festive, as if a New Year's mood, were scurrying back and forth shoppers, searching in the numerous labor list of shining stores suitable for themselves in terms of the ratio of price-quality goods. A large-scale advertising campaign conducted by the complex on the internet and television gave the desired result. People flocked to the shopping center from all over the city, attracted by the enticing promises of unprecedented low prices. Everywhere Cindy looked, the stores were crowded. People spared no effort or time to buy what they liked at a bargain, so they were meticulously searching through the clothes on the racks and the roller conveyor belts that lined the halls. The neighboring shoe stores were also busy. Tired women salesmen had to run around like mad from the morning to please the fastidious and sometimes very temperamental customers. Right in front of Cindy's face, in one of the shoe boutiques, a whole drama was unfolding, involving 3 pairs of fall boots. A blushing, rather full-bodied woman with wildly swiveling eyes was yelling at the young saleswoman. From the scraps of dialogue that came to the nurse's ears, she was able to deduce that it was about a discount on all 3 pairs of shoes. Allegedly, those boots were not adapted to the Russian size, and therefore, since it was a mistake of the store, they should have made them even more discount. At least this is what the customer insisted on. The poor saleswoman, in turn, tried to explain to the insistent customer that all the shoes in their store are already sold at the lowest prices, taking into account the general promotion held in the shopping center. Cindy didn't hear the end of the story. She was too disgusted by the shouting of this obviously not poor lady. The girl never understood such people. In her humble opinion, if you came to the store as a customer, you should play by the rules. After all, salesmen are people like you, and their work is not easy either. If you don't like something in a particular store, you can always go and look for another one, where you will find a product that meets your needs and your wallet. Cindy herself also came to the store for a reason. She needed to buy herself an autumn coat and half boots, preferably on a flat, but ergonomically correct, comfortable platform. At the same time, the girl wanted to buy a few warm turtlenecks to go to work in them, and a couple of beautiful blouses to be able to wear them on festive occasions, birthday at work colleagues, or going to the theater. The nurse went up to the second floor of the shopping center, and then she realized that she had a lot of stores and large clothing. Mass markets, literally eyes running around, during the time when the girl did not need to visit here. There were a lot of new names, and shouting, beautiful signs. At the same time delighted, but also somewhat discouraged by the huge selection. Cindy did not like to spend much time in stores. The girl began to slowly explore the assortment of one boutique after another, now and then quietly oohing at the beautifully made but still unreasonably expensive prices. Of course, huge discounts and large-scale promotion were not completely true, as in any shopping center of such level. And this was the largest complex in their city. Sellers would never dare to work at a loss, even for the sake of good, from the economic point of view, customer demand. Here and there, the really good stuff was marginally cheaper than on a typical day, so Cindy's task of picking out a new closet became incredibly difficult. She herself would never have come to such a pompous place if it were not for the sheer necessity. It so happened that those stocks of fall clothes, which the girl has always used for 6 years, simply worn out to such an extent that they could be safely used only for rags. Even Cindy's mother, an extremely frugal woman who was not accustomed to luxury, advised her to update her closet. Cindy, my girl, look what's left of your fall sweater. It's a disaster. The fabric's faded here, and look at this. The moth has already made a real hole in it. Baby, you can't do that. And your coat and your boots. Look at what you're wearing. You could be out of work faster than a bullet. It's not like you're working in a bed. And breakfast, you've got to do the bare minimum. Cindy was terribly ashamed of herself because she had always lived by the principle of buy it and wear it to the end, and she didn't really care much about her appearance. However, her mother's words made her think. Indeed, she bought some things strictly out of necessity, but if her clothes were really out of order due to global wear and tear, wasn't that a reason to buy a new one, thus making a small holiday? Cindy has always liked beautiful and practical quality things. In this regard, she has always been interested in English and Japanese fashion, watching specialized sites, selections, etc. Style of these exotic for a girl countries very much impressed her, but she was well aware that on the salary of a nurse, and even with an elderly mother in her arms, it is not much to go around. If they were in the mid-range, Cindy would be able to get by on a couple of fashions a year. But the price tag started from several tens of thousands of rubles. And that was just ordinary, everyday clothes like the same turtlenecks, skirts, or blazers. Cindy sadly turned over another label with the price of a coat she liked. 57,000 rubles. My God, that's almost 2 months of living on that money. If you don't get fancy and don't eat in the canteen in the morning, she thought, sadly putting aside the things she liked. The seller, meanwhile, looked suspiciously at the very modestly dressed potential buyer. To his credit, the guy, consultant, did not pester the girl with questions like, "Do you need any advice?" and gave her the opportunity to wander around the store quietly, once again convinced of how far her income was from the way she really wanted to dress. After a dozen more boutiques and a mountain of clothes, Cindy was even more frustrated. Almost everything that caught her eye either didn't fit her, she was slender but not model-like, or was prohibitively expensive. Taking a deep breath and coming to terms with reality, Cindy resolutely headed for the escalator leading to the top floor of the mall, where, judging by the colorful acid-colored signs, there was a grand sale on premium economy clothing. When the girl passed by the food court, a huge area with popular fast food restaurants and mini cafes offering various cuisines of the world, her attention was attracted by a large, colorful slot machine, half filled with various cute toys. There were soft characters from Disney cartoons and cute dolls remotely resembling the famous Beauty Barbie, and even boxes of cars. In short, prizes for every taste. Anyone could try their luck by dropping only 30 rubles into the machine's receiver, thus triggering the mechanism by means of which a person tried to pull out the toy he liked. Besides Cindy, there was already a small queue of 5 people at the machine, among whom one little girl, about 6 or 7 years old, stood out. The girl looked at the line of players with interest, but kept a little apart. Her neat but poor and simple clothes made her look like a child from a very humble family, perhaps even an orphan. A simple skirt of woolen cloth of an unmarred dark gray color, the same woolen thick black tights, and a light but terribly greasy from time, red-green jacket, under which a thin beige sweater peeped out. That was the girl's entire outfit. There were no earrings in her ears, no bows or anything that wealthy mothers like to decorate their adored daughters with. In addition, Cindy was surprised to see that the child had no bag or briefcase, no shoe bag, although by all outward appearances it was obvious that she should have been at school at this time, not looking at the colorful, soft piglets and Winnie the Poohs in the arcade. The child stood looking at the actions of other kids with admiration. The girl's large, light gray eyes, with great interest and a slight envy, watched what was happening. It was evident that she herself would like to play such a fascinating game, but for some reason she couldn't do it. She probably just doesn't have any change with her. Cindy reasoned, and determined to please the little girl, she got in line behind the players as well, throwing the change into the receiver. The girl watched with pleasure as the machine lit up with a dozen rainbow lights and the massive steel paw. The mechanism that allows you to get a toy suddenly came to life under her fingers and quickly moved from one side of the glass booth to the other. The nurse thought that this game really awakens in her a kind of childish excitement. Even if she could not buy herself the clothes she liked, but she could certainly make the child happy. The girl firmly held the paw with the joystick. All the while, the mechanism was moving smoothly around the cabin, and then, at the right moment, deftly pressed a large round button located on the front panel of the machine. The paw came down with a grinding sound and clutched the toy with its powerful iron claws. Cindy clutched the button as hard as she could, so that the machine wouldn't drop the coveted prize. Thank goodness it did. A moment later, a pretty, brightly colored doll, one of Barbie's illegal sisters, fell noisily into the slot at the bottom of the cabin. Cindy looked first at the prize, and then at the girl in the red and green jacket with a smile. "Take it. It's for you." Smiling at the little girl, Cindy handed her her prize. "Don't worry, I don't need a doll. I'm an adult, but I think you could still use one. Take it, it's a gift." The nurse winked at the girl, and she seemed to thaw, stretching her small mouth in an embarrassed smile. But she accepted the toy from Cindy's hands. There was a quiet, childlike joy in the child's eyes, but the girl never said a word out loud. "Don't think she's a good girl," said the voice of a saleswoman who had come out of the store across the street and had been watching the scene behind Cindy's back. "She's a good girl, but she's mute. Doesn't speak at all." Cindy turned around. How could she? The girl was genuinely surprised. What about her parents? Does she have parents? The saleswoman just shrugged her shoulders. "I don't know about her parents. I haven't seen them. Maybe she does, or maybe she ran away from the orphanage. You can see that her clothes are very poor. Anyway, she's always hanging around, running around the complex, looking in stores and cafes, but she doesn't buy anything. I guess she doesn't have any money." Cindy's heart clenched painfully as she felt sorry for the little girl. She was only 6 years old, and so alone. Cindy decided to help her, to take her home, for it was nearing evening, and it was not safe for her to walk the streets alone. As for clothes, well, she could buy last year's clothes at a second-hand store, although earlier Cindy had tried to avoid such stores. Today's trip to the brand stores had changed her views a lot. It was unlikely that the clothes off someone else's shoulder, even if not the newest ones, would be worse than the prohibitively expensive Chinese clothes that the premium economy supermarket could offer her today, which she didn't really want to go to. Having made a decision, the nurse extended a hand to the girl and asked her, "What's your name?" Do you want me to help you get home and walk you home? The girl shook her head affirmatively and smiled as she pulled a small piece of paper, probably torn from a notebook, out of her jacket pocket and handed it to Cindy. She took the scrap and looked at the blurred letters. It was a note with the address, street, and house where the girl probably lived. It also said the following: "My name is Alice. I can't speak, but I would be very grateful if you would take me home. The address is on the right side of the sheet. Thank you." Cindy read the contents and realized that the note was probably written by an adult. That was a good sign. It meant that the girl had someone close to her, and she might not be living in an orphanage, but with a family. Then it was all the more necessary to hurry. It was about to get dark outside, and Alice's relatives were probably already worried. What a joke. So much time and no supervision. Cindy nodded and held out her hand to the little girl. "Come on, Alice. I'll help you get home." The child calmly stretched out her hand, the other one still clutching the doll she had given her. Together with Cindy, the girl went down to the first floor and left them all. And then, slowly, according to all the rules of traffic, they crossed the road on a green light and got on the bus to the stop they needed. As they rode along, Cindy involuntarily sank into her own memories of how she herself had once been a small and cheerful girl. Too, Cindy herself grew up in a far from wealthy family and was never spoiled with money, expensive gifts, or toys from famous manufacturers. Her father, Alexander, worked as an intercity bus driver. He drove people around the cities and surrounding villages from morning until late at night. The man always said to himself that he was doing a useful and necessary thing for society. There were a pond of city buses, and the drivers were often caught on them, worse than in a cab. And you tried to drive intercity buses, to watch the road for several hours without a break. Not everyone can handle such a responsible business. And then, who, if not him, will drive elderly people from the village to the city and back? In short, Cindy's father loved his work and considered it, even to some extent, a noble occupation, even though he was a proletarian. The girl's mother, in turn, worked as a midwife in the labor ward of the city hospital. How many new lives brought Mealy to this world for 30 years of her practice? You can lose count if you think to count. At the same time, the woman never lost heart, even if at her work sometimes there were tragic cases. But that's what life is. That in it all sorts of things happen. Therefore, Cindy's mother, no matter how difficult it sometimes did not have to be, always tried to stay in a good mood and do not lose faith in the best, which taught her favorite daughter. In such an intelligent family, the girl spent the first years of her life. When Cindy grew up, she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps and also devote her life to medicine. All the more so because the girl already had all the prerequisites for it. As long as Cindy remembered, always tried to help her yard dogs, treated them, and provided first aid if they suddenly managed to fight unsuccessfully with a wild pack of stray dogs. Sometimes the girl was also trained in diagnoses, the neighbors' cats. This she, by the way, was doing quite well, so that all acquaintances and relatives, with one voice, told the girl that she should definitely become a veterinarian. Mealy, having learned about her daughter's success in this field, advised her to become a therapist. Say, there and her attentiveness will come in handy, and the ability to quickly determine the most well-known diseases. After that, if everything will suit her, you can think about higher education, to get which was a secret dream of young Cindy. However, to get a higher education and enter the university on the budget required either great ability or great material resources, and both, alas, the girl did not have. Cindy studied well, even graduated from school with a silver medal, but to enter the budget, she lacked exactly 10 points. The girl, then very much upset, and then to help, strangely enough, came to the father. Usually Alexander preferred not to participate in women's conversations, believing that he was never given the ability to fully comprehend the subtle mental organization of women. But here was a different matter. Here, It was about the fate of his beloved daughter, who, possessing good abilities, could not break through the hardened bureaucratic system of domestic education. Then, for the first time in 16 years, the father decided to give his daughter some advice. "Cindy, my daughter, why are you so upset?" "Well, you didn't get into this snobbish university. But it's worse for them. They don't know what kind of specialist they've lost." Cindy looked at her father through her tears. "Stop it, Dad. You don't have to make me feel better. I know perfectly well that I'm not up to their level. I'm no match for a simple girl from the provinces." Alexander only frowned. "What kind of level are you not up to, daughter?" "Ah, well, look at me. Have you realized what a stupid thing you've said? Their level is money too, Grix, you know." "No, I do not argue. There are talented guys who got there by their own labor and maybe even managed to get on the budget. But if you look objectively, there are only 2 or 3 geniuses there. And the rest? What?" "What?" a crying Cindy asked. Father rounded his eyes funny. He always did that when he wanted to make his upset daughter laugh. "And that these fools will study only at the expense of their parents' big money. But neither they nor our society will benefit from such studies, and our society understands it very well. Therefore, this is my advice to you." Cindy and her mother looked at her father in surprise. "Why are you looking at me as if I had swallowed an Egyptian pyramid?" The man jokingly took offense. "What I'm trying to say is that Cindy should go to medical school to be a nurse. It's the most honest job for her. You can't fool anybody with money, and it doesn't matter. And a good nurse at nowadays, you know, and day with fire, cannot find it. You come to the clinic, and you cannot even give you a normal injection. All the nurses are pretty, as if in a model magazine, and when it comes to the case, so in general for his life, you begin to fear. So put that all the gods after this injection, remember all the gods. That Russian, that not Russian." The last phrases Alexander said with difficulty, wading through the laughter of his wife and daughter, who at this time were laughing hard, holding their stomachs from funny colics. At the same time, the main idea of her father, the girl perfectly understood. It is possible to try herself, though in a less prestigious profession, but however, much more practical and necessary than many years of academic study, with further internship. She can always think about higher education later. Cindy thought to herself, but in the present she wanted to get the same practical skills her mother had, so that she could help people properly. Mealy was supportive of her daughter's desire to change the direction of her education, and through persistence and careful preparation for the exams, Cindy was able to easily enter medical school, where she studied brilliantly until graduation. As a nurse in the therapy department of the same hospital where her mother once worked, Cindy began a new life. She rented a private room close to home and her main place of employment, so that she wouldn't have to bother her parents with night shifts and would be able to get to her post on time. Remembering her love for dogs as her first patients, Cindy did not forget about her 4-legged friends. She always gave the leftovers of her lunch to the yard dogs. Having worked quietly for the first 2 years after graduating from medical school, Cindy first encountered serious trouble in the form of the new head of the department. John was an extremely unattractive man. Both morally and in appearance. Small in stature, plump with tiny slit eyes, and a dangerously grinning, crooked mouth, he nevertheless managed to be known in the hospital as a real catcher. Not a day passed without another rumor about Mr. John's love affairs. None of the nurses knew for sure whether these rumors were real or whether their superintendent had simply made them up. Nevertheless, Cindy had to face the darkest of these stories in person. On a couple of occasions, the girls at the ward's front desk had whispered that John was hitting on young nurses. And if they refused, he would deliberately get them fired. Sometimes, if the superintendent liked someone very much, he'd set the nurses up with medication, and with the threat of jail, he'd get his way. Cindy tried not to believe the gossip, but just in case, she kept her distance from the new superintendent, and she didn't like him. Sometimes he would look at her so much that she wanted to fall through the ground, which was unpleasant for the girl. One day, when Cindy's shift was coming to an end, and there were only a couple of people left in the hospital, as always were during a shift change, John suddenly pinned her in a corner near the locker room. "Well, come to me, Cindy, my sweet," the superintendent whispered passionately, pressing closer and closer and closer to the girl's body. Cindy wanted to scream, but the man covered her mouth with his rough palm. "You think carefully about what you're giving up. Well, quietly. What's the use of scaring people? Let's go to the residence room. There's no one there now. If you want, I've got wine too. Let's go." Cindy felt the man's other hand trying to lustfully stroke her breasts. She wanted to scream as loudly as she could, but then the whole ward would be there, and Cindy didn't want to be embarrassed. The noise in her ears overpowered the thud of her own heartbeat as Cindy managed to get up and kick the man in the groin. John let out a prolonged howl, and she managed to use that momentary advantage to get away from him as quickly as possible. From that moment on, work became a living hell for Cindy. The rebuff she gave to the superintendent not only did not cool his ardor, but on the contrary, only inflamed his lecherous feelings. He had frightened Cindy with all the things he had demanded of her, but the girl was adamant, and one day she even decided to tell John that if he didn't stop molesting her and other girls, she would record it all on a tape recorder and submit it to the police so that they could deal with him. For sure. Well, grinned the superintendent. "You can pack your things in advance, you bastard. I'll arrange such a setup with illegal drugs for you that you will not soon get out of jail. You'll be begging me to take yours and let you go. But I'm not going to take my statement on principle because there are so many of you nowadays. So proud." "Just try it, John," Cindy said icily. "How much are you willing to bet that I'm not wearing a listening device right now, and that some investigator isn't listening to our conversation all this time?" "You wouldn't dare," John swore. "It is better not to tempt fate, Mr. Director," warned him brave nurse. "It will be worse for you." God knows how much fear Cindy was actually suffering at that moment, but she could not see any other way out. One way or another, the disgusting superintendent had forced the nurses in their ward to have intimate relations time and time again, and many had already suffered from the scoundrel's antics. John avenged the girl for the refusal and threats as he could, constantly left her on night shifts, deprived her of bonuses and legal days off, and even sometimes forced her to perform the duties of an orderly. The girl proudly performed all the tasks, stayed for 3 days at work, and suffered terribly from the injustice of money that she had no intention to give up. And the superintendent still did not dare to fulfill his main threat regarding the story with the forbidden drugs. Fear of being exposed for his own vices that stopped him for the time being. So Cindy suffered for about a year, and then there was grief in her family. Alexander died suddenly. He was ill during the flight. The girl took a few days off at her own expense to help her mother with the funeral and just to support her. For Cindy herself, the loss of her father was a heavy blow. She was used to the fact that in the most hopeless moments of her life, she always had at least one man's shoulder to lean on. And it was her father's shoulder. Cindy had never told him or her mom about the problems at work. She didn't want to alarm them. Now it seemed to her that if she had told Alexander everything, he would have helped her find a way out of the situation, or at least given her sound advice. Cindy's mom, Miley, gave up after the death of her husband. Her daughter realized that if she left the woman alone with her thoughts now, something very bad might happen to her. So Cindy moved out of her rented room and came back home to look after her mom and help her through this difficult time. And that's how they've lived ever since. Mealy kept watching the house, and Cindy stayed at the hospital 24 hours a day, secretly wishing that their monstrous superintendent would finally be fired. 3. Finally, Cindy and little Alice made their way to the private sector on the outskirts of town where Stone's house was located. As the nurse approached the dilapidated house, she noticed how overgrown and unkempt the tiny lot in front of the girl's house looked. There was unfriendly, tall grass everywhere, and the fence was already so badly mangled that it seemed ready to collapse at any moment. Entering the old, shabby hallway, Cindy was a little confused at first, with only an old cabinet to lean on to take off her shoes and a dusty light bulb hanging from a wire. There was a large, round mirror, which was tarnished from time, and which no one in the family seemed to use at all. Cindy was surprised that she was not greeted by the parents of the little girl. It was quite late in the afternoon, and they could have taken care of their child. Little Alice signaled for her to undress and come into the room. Cindy, with difficulty, pulled off her old boots, and threw off her old boots, and threw off her jacket. There was no hanger nearby, so the girl just folded her things and put them on the ancient cabinet. Taking a few steps toward the living room, Cindy involuntarily wrinkled her nose at the sharp smell of various medicines. At least it's not alcohol, the nurse thought to herself, and then she cautiously entered the room. There was no one there but Alice herself. The girl looked around uncertainly. The situation here was truly depressing. On the walls bubbled yellowed old wallpaper, in several places already very much off the walls. There was only a large, square Soviet-style table, a couple of chairs and a large chest of drawers, where, obviously, all the clothes of the owners were placed. On top of the chest of drawers was a small antique radio, which continued to quietly tell something, despite the fact that, apparently, there was no one else in the house. Good evening. Is anyone here? I've brought your daughter, or granddaughter. The nurse called out to the girl's older relatives. Alice immediately came up to the girl and tugged at her sleeve, shaking her head. What? What are you trying to tell me? Cindy didn't understand. Are you alone here? Alice pointed toward the back of the house, pulling her new acquaintance with her. Cindy obeyed the child's wishes and walked on. As she passed through the narrow, dusty hallway, Cindy noted to herself that it would be a good idea to clean and tidy up the place. When she reached the small room at the back of the house, Cindy heard exactly what she had feared. Human moans. Certain that someone drunk was lying in the room, the girl first backed away, but the girl looked at her pleadingly, and again pointed her pleadingly, and again pointed her hand toward the room. Help me, please, her gray eyes seemed to say. Well, okay, Cindy sighed and slowly pushed the door open. Inside, the nurse was immediately hit in the nose by the strongest odor of antibiotics and cold ointments. Menthol and eucalyptus so strongly saturated the air that it was hard to even breathe, let alone try to help someone. Cindy rushed to the small square window, intending to open it. There's no air in here at all. We need to air everything out, and it's urgent, she explained in response to Alice's incomprehensible look. Only then could she get a good look at the man lying on the simple wooden bed. He was still young, about 35 years old at most. His skin was red, as if he had been injected with a huge dose of some powerful allergen. There were several bottles of fever medicine on the table next to him, and a couple of open packages of antibiotic pills lying around. Cindy touched the man's forehead. He was burning up. No wonder he couldn't come to his senses and was delirious. The high fever was burning him from the inside out, making him feverish all the time. The man, meanwhile, continued to mumble in delirium only two names: Alice and Victoria. Leaning closer to him, the girl realized what was the reason for such abundant redness of the skin. The patient obviously overdid it with warming ointments, obviously deciding that it is applied as much as possible and immediately on the whole body, starting from the neck and ending with the whole body, starting from the neck and ending with the heart area. My God, is that your father? She asked the girl in astonishment. She stood in the doorway looking at Cindy questioningly. Yes. She shook her little blonde head affirmatively. He's very sick, you know, she asked again. And while doing so, she furtively placed a thermometer on the man to take his temperature. Alice only shrugged her shoulders. Can you show me Approximately how many days he has been lying like this? Asked the girl, and for clarity showed her own hands. The girl thought for a couple of seconds and then showed both of her small hands with 5 fingers spread out. 10 days. Cindy was amazed. Oh my God, he needs an ambulance right away. It's very dangerous, Alice. The girl came closer to the nurse and shook her sleeve again, shaking her head. What? Are you afraid to stay here alone? Cindy asked. The girl nodded. Do you have any other relatives? Second, and another nod of the head. Negative. Okay. Cindy took a deep breath of the drug-addled air and ruffled her own thick mane of brown hair. The thermometer, meanwhile, beeped, signaling that its job was done. The nurse looked at the thermometer and got a chill 39.7. Do you promise me that you won't go anywhere while I try to help your daddy? The girl realized that without urgent medical help and ease, the girl's father most likely would not live until morning, especially since, apparently, no one even fed him all this time. As soon as Alice promised Cindy that she would stay home and keep a close eye on her dad's condition, the nurse immediately rushed to the nearest pharmacy to get help. Self-medication is a very dangerous thing, especially if a person is not often ill and has no idea how certain groups of drugs work. It was obvious that the girl's father had tried to help himself by passing the doctors and the clinic, and here was the sad result. Cindy found a 24-hour pharmacy, and there she bought everything she needed. During her work in the hospital, she had to deal with severe inflammation of the lungs, and the young man, now lying in an old house on the outskirts of the private sector, had it. The girl had learned hundreds of appointments, and now she was sure that she could still save the father of little Alice. After returning from the pharmacy, the nurse immediately put the boy on a drip with a good medicine for fever and began to treat him herself. But now she acted according to all the rules of science. Since the little girl was afraid to be alone, unsupervised, Cindy called her mother and told her that she would be staying with a friend for a couple of days. She didn't want to worry her mother too much. She was still too weak and emotionally unstable after the story with her father. A new portion of negative emotions and anxiety would not be good for her. When she was sure that her patient was out of danger, she hurried to prepare a simple but hearty lunch for Alice. On her way to the pharmacy, Cindy had managed to stop by the supermarket, and now she watched with pleasure as the girl devoured mashed potatoes and patties of her own making. As it turned out, Alice had been eating old, dried-up bagels and breadcrumbs, a bag of which had long been stashed by her father in the pantry just in case. The girl had learned about all this by examining the house for herself. She was a little relieved when she saw the bathroom in the girl's room. Despite the apparent poverty, there was no unsanitary conditions there, and Alice still had some toys, albeit the simplest. Cindy returned to her father's room after feeding the little girl and letting her draw in the nursery. Opening the dresser, she found a man's passport and learned that his name was Tony. The passport also contained a note that the girl's father was married. But what had become of his wife? Having clarified the situation, Cindy calmed down. One way or another, it was obvious that no one drank alcohol in the house, nor did they use anything illegal, and that was a good sign. The nurse could only wonder how this family had gotten themselves into such difficult circumstances. Cindy spent 2 days with Alice and Tony, during which time she still managed to bring down her unexpected patient's fever. However, Cindy could not leave just yet. The man had not regained consciousness and was too exhausted to give any assurances about his future condition. And there was someone to look after the girl, wasn't there? The girl called the hospital and took a few more days off her vacation, for which the superintendent gave her a real scandal. After she managed to convince John to take the weekend off, Cindy called her mom and asked her not to worry, because she would be coming to work right away, and again for 2 days in a row. Miley, of course, was worried about her daughter, but used to trust her decisions because the girl had long been an adult and quite in control of her own life. not needing constant supervision from her own mother. Having settled this part of the issue, Cindy continued to put on her feet Alice's father, and at the same time cooked her meals, tried to play with her, and read her bedtime story. One afternoon, Cindy needed a large pair of fabric scissors. Her skirt had torn unexpectedly, so much so that part of the hem needed to be cut off carefully in order to hem the unfortunate couple of centimeters. Cindy went into one of the rooms and tried to find something similar. And when she looked at the wall, she stopped abruptly. On the wall hung a large, beautiful portrait of a young woman who looked remarkably like Cindy herself. Of course, it was not an exact copy of the girl, but at the first second seeing this photo, she really thought that she was looking at her absolute double. The woman in the photo had beautiful short hair, a much darker and deeper shade than Cindy's, as well as different clothes and makeup. The nurse carefully removed the photograph from the wall and showed it to the girl. "Honey, who is this woman?" Cindy asked her. Alice looked at the photo and then at her temporary guardian. The girl also noticed the striking resemblance between the two aunts, but she couldn't answer anything intelligible, just waving her hands apart. She was obviously seeing the portrait for the first time. "I see," Cindy sighed. "You don't know either. Well, that's too bad." Cindy rushed to Tony's room and almost shrieked with joy. The man had regained consciousness and had accidentally dropped the mug of water that Cindy always left on the nightstand just in case. "What's going on? Where am I?" Tony spoke very slowly, struggling to form the syllables into words, the effects of being unconscious for so long. Cindy walked over and tried to calm him down, only to be met with a look of amazement on the man's face. "Victoria? Victoria, is that you? My darling? Am I in heaven? Are you here with me? Who's going to be with Alice?" "No, I'm sorry. You've made a mistake. I'm not Victoria. My name is Cindy, and I'm here to help you and your daughter. I'm a nurse." Shocked at what he heard, Tony tried to sit up in bed. The girl helped him by tucking a couple pillows under his back. The man was breathing heavily and looked at Cindy with tear-filled eyes. "Oh my God. How is that possible? You're an exact replica of her, my wife. My late wife. I'm sorry, I realize how awful that sounds." It's okay, Cindy assured him. "Don't worry. You need to get well and take care of your daughter. The rest can wait, trust me." Cindy smiled, but Tony looked into her eyes with a scrutinizing gaze. "You're right. In fact, I realize now that it's impossible. You're a completely different person, Cindy, a stronger person. Victoria has always been soft. I'm afraid that's what ruined her at the last moment, when you couldn't give up, when you had to fight for your life." Tony began his story. He wanted to explain to the girl how he'd ended up in his present pull Victoria. Cindy listened to him very attentively, trying to find the answer to her own riddle. Why she and Tony's wife have the same face for two. 4. They met Victoria when they went to a job interview together to apply for the same company but for different positions. Tony wanted to try his luck at the position of wholesale purchasing manager, and Victoria dreamed of getting into the staff of economics. The girl had excellent math skills. That's how they got together, and the company took both, so that first friendly and later romantic relations of young people, fate seemed to give the green light. The couple went to work together, had lunch together in cafes, and together they left the same work. Having, in addition, a lot of common interests, the guy and the girl came to the conclusion that the wedding, the only correct and natural outcome of their relationship. It was said, done. Since Tony grew up in an orphanage, he himself could calmly manage his life. Victoria's parents were from an ordinary working family, and therefore did not hinder their daughter's choice to marry a good and purposeful guy, as Tony was. The celebration that followed 6 months later was modest but surprisingly beautiful. The Victorians and the bride seemed to glow with love for each other. Immediately after the wedding, the Stone couple rented a small apartment near the center, and at first, Everything was just fine. Problems began when it turned out that Victoria is expecting a child. The girl, with all the power of her analytical mind, had an extremely fragile health, and the first pregnancy, in this sense, was a real challenge for her. Doctors constantly insisted that Victoria lay in the hospital for preservation, as the girl found a serious threat of miscarriage. However, the girl was not only smart, but also stubborn. She, of course, listened to the doctors, lay for several weeks in the hospital, but also managed to work remotely, trying to maintain the level of income, which they, by that time, so successfully came out. There was always one trait in Victoria's character that inevitably caused her young husband, if not irritation, then certainly some obvious regret. The fact that if the girl did not succeed in something, she could suddenly take and just give up giving up, deciding that this event or thing, and just give up giving up, deciding that this event or thing is not worth it to keep trying to come to them. The same thing happened with the pregnancy. Tony suspected that at some point, Victoria had gotten bored with being wrongly pregnant and leading an almost reclining lifestyle, and so she had given up. Project of her new life closed, and sudden depression brought its devastating fruits. Premature labor, during which there was a serious complication, caused a large internal bleeding, and Tony's wife died right on the operating table. The only thing she managed to do was to release into our world their common with Tony daughter. After that, Victoria's heart stopped forever. She didn't even get to see and hug her baby girl. The next few months seemed to Tony the most real hell. The man was left alone with unbearable heartache. In his heart it seemed that someone had cut a huge hole with an icebreaker, and now this huge icy hole could not be filled with anything. The only bright spot in the whole story, which somehow kept him afloat and made him get out of bed every morning, was the care of his newborn daughter, whom he named Alice. The young widower took care of his tiny daughter as best he could. The girl was still very weak and constantly needed a quick checkup and some special procedures, like being in an oxygen chamber or massage for babies. Many doctors looked at the single father with frank pity. Frankly speaking, none of them was sure that his daughter would live more than a few months, so fragile because of premature birth was her little body. However, the doctors did everything possible till Alice went on the mend. And despite the most skeptical predictions of doctors, the condition of the little patient still stabilized, thereby giving hope for life and her young father. A month later, the girl was discharged and given to Tony. Taking the child from the hospital, the guy could not hold back the tears. Alice was an exact copy of his untimely deceased mother, before finally feel the ground under their feet. Father and daughter had to go through a lot of hardships, the main of which was a severe lack of money. The apartment where Tony and Victoria lived, the guy had to exchange it for a much more modest house on the outskirts of the city in the private sector. The girl had to undergo a long and expensive course of treatment, and also needed special dry mixes of high quality and a ton of other things. So money at that moment was more important than the status of their housing. Even though the house they lived in now was far from the center and was quite modest, it was still a house, and a strong and warm one, which was especially important for a father and daughter in winter, when the city was experiencing severe cold weather. Like all single fathers, Tony had to go through a course of young fighter. He learned to swaddle the girl, change a diaper, calculate the time of cooking dry formula, put the baby to bed, and of course, bathe her in a small tub. In order to provide the girl with everything necessary, the young father had to work incredibly hard. He could sometimes until late in the evening to stay in the office, but in this case always resorted to the services of Auri, nanny, because he could not leave the child, and even a baby, absolutely alone in an empty house. These services also cost a lot of money, but Tony had no choice. Since he grew up in an orphanage and never knew his parents, there was simply no one to help him. At first, acquaintances and neighbors of the guy did not believe that he would be able to cope with such a serious task as raising a weakened and premature baby. People thought that since Tony himself is a young man, he would quickly get bored with the ascetic lifestyle and fiddling. With a sick child, so most likely he would soon surrender the baby to the orphanage. He himself would continue to enjoy his life as if nothing had happened. Such wild thoughts only made Tony terribly angry. Never, and under no circumstances, he would not give his Alice in an orphanage, or even worse, in a baby home. Only someone who had spent half his life in the walls of such institutions could understand the young widower's feelings when it was hinted at. Therefore, over time, Tony reduced contact with neighbors to a minimum, while continuing to quietly raise his beloved daughter. Time passed, and Tony was full of energy and optimism. He still worked a lot, but he and Alice began to live noticeably better, and in dealing with the baby guy has already adapted and began to feel much more confident. The only thing that really upset the guy, it is a delay in the development of his daughter. It so happened that by the time she was 6 years old, Alice had not yet uttered a single word. How many doctors he and her father? It was impossible to count, and both in public clinics and private medical centers. They were told the same thing. With the speech apparatus in the baby, everything is fine. So, the only possible reason, a slight lag in development. But everything is correctable. You just need to find good speech therapists. And more recently, Tony began to have problems with work. The recent crisis came as a thunderclap and entailed a series of layoffs, under one of which, unfortunately, fell and he himself. Dismissed, the man was left without means of subsistence, and in his arms he had a beloved daughter who could not understand why Daddy sits at home all day long, circling some lines in the newspaper with a red marker. After studying several dozen job advertisements, Tony sent his resume to potential employers many times, but none of them responded. Problems with logistics forced the already impoverished entrepreneurs to find ways out of this critical situation themselves, without resorting to the services of additional managers, and thus reducing their expenses. Finally, after a lot of rejections, the young widower decided to send everything to hell and got a job as a loader in a convenience store. The job turned out to be very hard physically, but it paid good money, and it was now his only way to support his small family. One day, when the man was working the night shift, leaving Alice in the care of a nanny, on the street, where he was unloading a huge truckload of goods, suddenly poured a very heavy downpour, making Tony instantly soaked to the skin. It was impossible to leave his job, so the single father tried to hold on as best he could and endured the unbearable cold and unpleasant dampness all over his body. Later, when he got home, he felt his temperature rising. As a shelter boy, Tony was in good health, hardened by the difficult living conditions, but even this did not help him to cope with the disease in a short time. Inflammation of the lungs seized him too quickly, and although the man bought all sorts of medicines that so insistently offered colorful advertising in pharmacies, they did not give the desired effect, but only on the contrary, almost sent him to God. To meet with his beloved wife, Alice, of course, tried as she could to help her father. For example, she brewed him tea with lemon, instinctively hoping that it would ease his suffering. But by and large, she could not even call him a doctor. And he himself, by this time, was already in a semi-conscious state. That left his girl nothing else but to run to the shopping center and admire the bright shop windows and beautiful toys in them. Her father hadn't bought her much in the last few months, but a child is a child is a child is a child. After 3 weeks, when Tony had gotten stronger and was able to move around the house more or less steadily, Cindy calmed down. The girl's father was on the mend, which meant that his life was no longer in danger. At the moment when the man got out of bed for the first time, Alice, who had been in her room until then, ran to her father's room and jumped into his arms, suddenly shouting with joy and full voice, "Daddy!" Daddy recovered. Stunned by what had happened, Tony looked first at his daughter in amazement and then slowly turned his gaze to the young nurse. The latter only smiled and whispered happily, "I don't know how this could happen, but it's just incredible." The girl's father could not hold back tears of joy and began to tickle and cover his favorite daughter with hundreds of kisses. "My darling, Alice, how happy you made your daddy just now. You have no idea." The little girl laughed happily and tried to say something else, but so far she was not very good at it. After all, the very first words for 6 years. Later, the doctors, examining the child, confirmed that it was a reaction of the growing organism to severe stress. It was this stress that triggered the process of opening the mind, resulting in the girl's newfound ability to speak. Now for Cindy, there was only one mystery left unsolved: how she could have a twin sister she never knew about. To find out the truth, she asked Tony for permission to borrow a picture of his wife. The man didn't mind, and the girl, taking Victoria's photo with her, went straight home to her mother. At first, Miley denied everything and pretended not to understand what it was about. But when Cindy showed her the photo of Tony's wife, the older woman sobbed with excitement and confessed everything. "I'm sorry, daughter. You're not our kin. Yeah, that's it. Your father and I were childless all our lives, and I wanted a child of my own. I was working as a midwife at the hospital at the time, so one came to us. She looked small and thin, but she gave birth to twins just like that, easily, without even agonizing. So I asked her to give me one of the babies. She, the mother, was from a poor family. No boyfriend, no job, nothing. So I told her, 'Why do you need two? You won't be able to raise either of them. And this way, at least you'll have a chance.' In the end, she agreed. I found out later that she didn't give up her second daughter, good for her, so she named her Victoria. I didn't know. I'm sorry, my daughter. I'm sorry if you can." Cindy, though shocked by her mother's confession, didn't blame her. After all, who knows how her own life would have turned out if it hadn't been for Miley coming to the aid of her unfortunate birth mother. Besides, from all the facts she had, Victoria, her sister, was also well educated and gifted in math, which meant that despite the tragic end, her life had also been full of light and love. This calmed the nurse somewhat, and she was able to accept the existing polar Victoria of things. Cindy began to maintain a relationship with Tony, first as a doctor, patient, and then as a friend. Gradually, feelings flared up between the young people, and they began to meet openly, and then to live under the same roof. It turned out that Alice did not even know who was depicted in that picture. And the picture of her mother was hanging high enough so she did not look at it much. A year later, Cindy and Tony were married. Little Alice is very happy because now she has a real mom. Meanwhile, the young couple began to repair and put in order their common house. They, although not very richly living, but quite satisfied with their lives and, most importantly, happy. In addition, soon in their family is expected addition, and little Alice is looking forward to the day when she can finally find out who she will have, a brother or still a sister.